This video is sponsored by me. That's right. The weekend retreat is happening again this year from the 11th to the 13th of July. And you don't want to miss it because this year we're studying Ecclesiastes. That's right. The book that I haven't been able to stop talking about or thinking about for the last 5 years. We're putting aside a whole weekend to look at it. So email lambda.retreats@gmail.com if you're interested. It's from the 11th to the 13th of July. Whether you're a deeply committed Christian and you have been for years and you want a based environment to have those honest conversations, or maybe you're an atheist, but there's been some part of you been saying, I should give God a chance, or perhaps you're just feeling lonely and isolated in the modern world. Either way, email lambda.retreats@gmail.com and come and join us. I've invited some of the internet's sharpest minds to a competition of intellect, cunning, and taste. Welcome, Black Horse. I'm throwing down the gauntlet. Do you accept the challenge?
Of course I accept the challenge.
Well, as you can see, this year I've massively overcomplicated the format. You will travel outwards from Lambda's landing. By the way, do you like the artwork? This is Poe's drawing.
Yeah, it's kind of fun. It's kind of fun.
So you start here in the middle of the island and you have to travel outwards to try to collect gold. You will put the gold in your pouch and you have to return to the Lambda's landing to put it in the treasury. So it's only the gold.
Okay.
Yeah, it's only the gold you've successfully returned. So you'll be fighting monsters and all kinds of things as you travel around. If you die at any point, you lose all the gold in your pouch. But the flip side of that is the further out you go, the more lucrative it is, the bigger the gold rewards. So you have to decide whether to gamble, you see.
I see.
So the first decision you have to make is, do you want to journey to the dunes of dishonesty, where you will encounter questions relating to culture, and then subsequent paths, as it splits, it then subdivides that. You could go to the biased bridge to talk about society. The East Crossroads are topics relating to knowledge, or the standing stones for ethics.
Well, the East Crossroads sound. We'll head east here. Seems like a good idea.
Yeah, you'll probably get the chance to come back to the landing and go a different direction at some point. So this is not a final decision for the rest of the stream.
Okay.
All right. Look, you're moving towards the East Crossroads, but alas, halfway, what should come across your path but Vitala, who is a sort of ghoulish spirit. Okay. Dirt spills from shroud-wrapped figure as the grave-dwelling ghoul emerges, its jaw unnaturally wide and ready to feed.
Okay,
so
I will face the beast, I guess.
Yes. Okay. So the knowledge is a special. Rather than being a discussion, this is more like a quiz. So this should be a fun little quiz. It's yes, if I can pull that up. Okay. Question 1. Which planet in the solar system rotates the fastest? I know it looks like it's multiple choice, but that is an illusion.
It is an illusion.
It's not actually multiple choice.
I suppose it is kind of multiple choice. There's only 8 to choose from.
That's true. Yes, and Pluto is not the answer.
Yeah.
Well,
it's definitely not Mercury because Mercury is tidally locked.
Mm-hmm. I was surprised about the answer to this one. I'll give you that clue.
Yeah. Rotates the fastest. Does that mean it's got the highest angular velocity, or does that mean it's got the shortest day?
The shortest day.
That's too bad, because if it was the highest angular velocity, you just choose the biggest planet. You're probably right.
But I will re-emphasize, I was surprised about the answer to this, given that it was how short the day is. It was probably it was the least expected answer in my mind. Intuitively, I thought this planet would have the longest days.
My guess is Uranus.
Okay, final answer?
Final answer.
That's not correct. Jupiter apparently actually has the
Interesting.
shortest day. Yeah. A day just under 10 hours.
Well,
that's okay because
it's got all those like really intense storms as a result.
Oh, that's true. Oh, so the storms maybe are
it has this really powerful Coriolis effect, right?
Mm-hmm. Okay, next question. What is the capital of New Zealand?
No, it's Christchurch.
Ooh, do you want to lock that in?
Yes, lock that in.
You're wrong again. I think the capital is Wellington.
Oh, jeez. Okay.
Shall I check this? But I also, my brain went to Auckland first thing.
Well, Auckland is the biggest city, but I realized I've been to Auckland. It's not the capital. The only other city I could think of in New Zealand is Christchurch. So
you're thinking of that shooting, probably.
Probably, yeah.
Okay. Third and final question is, which famous painting was stolen from the Louvre in 1911 and recovered in 1913?
I don't know anything about art.
Well, it's not an obscure painting.
The Mona Lisa?
Correct. Yes. Okay. So you've answered the questions. Now I put in your stats, and then I roll some dice, and we'll see if you've defeated the first beast.
The monster, yeah.
There's actually nothing on the line at this point because you'll just go back to the landing. So, but let's see. There's a very complicated calculation going on. Yeah, formula is state of the art. Oh, sad times.
That's too bad.
Yeah. All right. Let's head back to the map.
All right. I'm going to get to the standing stones this time. That's where I wanted to go in the first place.
There you go. Fine. I will return you to the landing, and then let's go to the standing stones, which is ethics. Uh-oh. You've been apprehended again, this time by the savage shifter. Bones crack. Go on, read it.
Bones crack and reform as the human before you transforms under the moonlight, twisting into a savage werewolf with jaws that can crush steel. I don't like my chances.
Okay, good luck. So the savage shifter is asking you to comment on, is ethics primarily about intentions or outcomes? There's not a right or wrong answer now. This is much more discursive.
Yeah. Ethics is much more about intention than it is about outcome. So consequentialist ethics have been a disaster for the human race, and they need to be completely rejected.
Long live Kant.
Yes. The reality here is that you can't actually accurately predict the outcomes of most actions, particularly most actions that have long-term consequences. The world is a chaotic system, complex system. Consequentialist ethics are primarily a shortcut to get away with things rather than a reasonable framework in which to operate. The best that a man can do is act correctly in the moment with the information that he has in front of him. And he cannot be held responsible for the chaotic world and the things which follow. Let justice prevail, though the whole world world falls.
So if a man comes to your front door with a knife and asks where your family are you permitted to lie? Or do you have to sort of just refuse to answer?
Well, so a consequentialist ethical framework would say that there's a direct, predictable result of that confrontation. I would say that in reality, if a man comes to my front door with a knife, the universe of possible outcomes is very wide. The universe of his possible intentions is very wide. And so I am permitted to take actions that assess the reasonably foreseeable consequences of whatever I do. So making a statement which is not accurate in that moment reflects a reasonably and immediately foreseeable outcome of my action. Right. My intention would be to protect my family. The action I take is to misdirect, and that might turn out to be the right or the wrong answer. It might be that the man with the knife is there to protect me from an angry mob or something, and lying to him might be the wrong choice. But all I can be held responsible for is the way it is the response to the reasonably foreseeable items that come kind of as an immediate consequence of my action. As I say, there's like a really wide universe of possible outcomes to that situation. And I just have to, I'm ethically accountable for the choice between the ethical priority of protecting my family, the ethical priority of honesty, and the ethical priority of treating the men with appropriate respect.
Is there a place within justice for weighing outcomes? Should somebody be punished for what actually happened, even if there was so like manslaughter, for example, I think is you've killed somebody, it was your fault, you didn't mean to do it, but you're still going to be punished.
Yeah, so the traditional So when you're exercising justice in the position of the sovereign, you have this situation where you can infer a person's intents, but you can't assure that your inference is 100% accurate, right? So you can come to me and you can say, I killed my brother in like a farming accident. It wasn't intentional. I just ran him over with the tractor by accident. And as the sovereign, I'm now in the position where I have to do justice. I can choose to believe or not choose to believe your story that it was an accident, but I can't know for sure. And that uncertainty on the part of the sovereign with regard to the intentions of the person under judgment is the reason why the person has to be punished on the basis of the consequences of the action, even if there's a reasonable chance that his intentions were appropriate.
So it's a hedge against a different type of injustice.
That's right. In that difficult position as a sovereign facing, maybe a more straightforward example is your brother is in a position where he's dying of cancer, and you altered his treatment to cause his death. Well, as the sovereign, I might believe your story that you did that as an act of mercy, but if I'm a sovereign and I see this 500 times, at least some of the people involved are killing their brother in order to obtain his inheritance, right? And because I can't know for sure what your intentions actually are, because I'm not a mind reader, I have to do justice on the basis of the information that I can actually have, rather than the kind of perfect justice which exists with God, who has perfect information.
Good. Well, let's see if you've defeated the savage shifter. You have success.
Victory. There we go.
And that means you've got 35 gold now in your pouch. If we head back to the map, I think that means you're going to successfully travel all the way to the Standing Stones. So now you've got the choice. You could go back and bank your gold, or you could carry on and explore the Cliffs of Curiosity for questions relating to theology, or the Meandering Meadow for questions relating to justice.
I think I'm going to the Cliffs of Curiosity.
All right. Cliffs of Curiosity. There we go. And would you believe it? There's Athene, silent as death. The massive owl descends from above, its feathers absorbing light rather than reflecting it, which I think just means that it's black, right? It's a sort of poetic way to say. And Athene is going to ask you, is suffering compatible with divine goodness?
Oh, of course suffering's compatible with divine goodness.
I thought you might say that.
So there's layers to the answer to this question. The first layer is the most obvious. We know from special revelation from the Bible that God is good, and we know that there's suffering in the world. Ergo, suffering is compatible with divine goodness. So there's the most straightforward possible answer.
Okay, yes.
However, the kind of more sophisticated version of this answer, the philosophical justification for why God can be good and suffering can exist, is there's kind of two layers to it. First of all, God, in order to advance his glory, created us with a degree of freedom that permitted suffering to enter the world, right? Because God wanted to get glory out of our choice to glorify him, rather than out of our mechanical response to be compelled to glorify him. The possibility for suffering, the possibility for evil entered the world, right? That capacity for wrongdoing then actualized itself repeatedly and remarkably. But the introduction of that capacity was actually part of God's goodness for trying to create the most glorious possible creation, right? Which is part of what makes God good. His desire to create the most glorious possible creation is part of what makes God good. And in a strange way, that goodness and that desire for the most glorious possible creation created the conditions which make suffering possible. Interestingly, God is often glorified in the most profound ways as his creation works through suffering, right? So suffering well is an opportunity to glorify God and an opportunity to experience God in ways that we can't experience him outside of that context. And so, while you might not wish suffering on yourself, I don't know of a single person who has had a life which is incredibly beautiful and incredibly glorifying to God that has not suffered in that life in order to create that beauty and to create and to glorify God in the most profound way in their life. And so in some ways, suffering and the capacity to suffer well is an element of God's goodness in this kind of world.
While I'm lining up the sort of theology, top 10 greatest hits of questions in theology.
Yeah.
Is good defined first, and then God
No.
shows his goodness by adhering to it? Or is goodness just defined as God's character?
So the definition of goodness is God's character, which is why I answered the question the way I did to begin with, right? We know that God is good, and we know that there is suffering in the world. Ergo, suffering is compatible with divine goodness, right?
But this would mean that if
we don't live in
if it
Plato's
so
world.
happened that God had a character that just led to every being created living in nothing but agony for no purpose, then that would also be definitionally good.
Yes, if God chooses to make you like Pharaoh and harden your heart against him and get glory out of crushing you, that is good and right, and glory to God for it.
I feel like if we were doing this live, then somebody would be writing based in the chat. It's the like, yes, Chad meme for the question of suffering.
Yeah, I mean,
you've got to be a bit careful, I suppose, discussing questions of suffering, because people listening may be very sensitive to the question, depending on what's going on in their life at that moment. It's easy when you're in a relatively easy patch in your life to be kind of at arm's length and philosophical about it. Whereas it's a very different feel to the question if it's less a philosophical conundrum and more of a yearning, a kind of a cry out for wishing suffering to end. That being said, I'm going to make comment on that.
I mean, the reality is those moments where, you know, everything in your body and everything in your emotions cries out to God, this is wrong. The expression of faith, the expression of trust in that moment is this incredibly beautiful and beautiful opportunity. And all of the most kind of profound and good moments in the history of Christendom all come out of this moment where the choice is between suffering and affirming God is good, and suffering and cursing God and dying, right? And that the response of faith and trust in that moment where everything around you cries out, you know, accuse God, right? It's this profound opportunity to experience God and to glorify God in your life. It has been granted onto you not only to believe in Christ, but to suffer for his name. Right? Scripture describes suffering as an opportunity and privilege granted to those God elects.
Well, I think you've given some very profound and important answers to this question. I want to drop something in that I guess hopefully people don't feel like this trivializes suffering, but if you asked people if they were going to go and watch a movie, would you like a movie in which none of the characters suffer? I don't think anybody would actually answer yes. Like, there's very few films that people like that involve no suffering.
This is the whole thing about the A.A. Milne books, the Winnie the Pooh books. He's like one of the only authors of all time to write children's books without conflict and suffering in them. Right? Very, very self-consciously so. But the fact that he's completely, like almost completely unique in this regard, answers the question in sort of photo negative.
Yeah, and if you were to pause the film at any moment when the characters are in peril and ask what you want for the characters, the people would, the kind of correct gut answer is, I want them to be immediately delivered from whatever they're going through so that they can just live a quiet, happy existence. That's sort of what you are sympathetically going through as a viewer. And yet it was the suffering that you experienced going along with the characters that made the experience of watching that movie meaningful and will draw you back to it again and again. Now, I as I say, that could be taken if somebody's going through really deep, serious suffering. I don't think they're gonna be able to have the same lighthearted attitude to the question that I'm expressing. So I want to kind of put a lampshade on that, as it were. But yes, should we see if you've defeated this kind of owl pigeon monster?
Yeah, let's see how I did.
Okay. Here you go. Your stats are in. It's going to be a tough one.
Discussion performance 72. Ouch.
I'll be honest. There's a lot of smoke and mirrors hiding not very much mechanism behind the scenes here. I hope people haven't been taking these scores too seriously because.
Well, I emerged victorious, nevertheless.
Yes. Right, back to the map. Okay, you are at the Cliffs of Curiosity. So you have the wrecked ship or the bone-strewn beach. Hang on, what are you doing over there? Okay, well, the person's standing in the wrong place. But I believe you are actually over here at the Cliffs of Curiosity. I must just have your coordinates plugged in wrong somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, my game instincts tell me to head back at this point, but I want to go to the bone-strewn beach, so we're going to do that.
Roll those dice. So spirituality is the topic relating to the beach. And would you believe it? You've encountered yet another creature. In this case, it's a hoplite. A sort of orcish, I guess.
An orcish hoplite.
Greek, yeah. Steel gleams as the knight levels their spear. I have to confess to having used some ChatGPT assistance in writing all these little sentences.
Well, it makes them a surprise anyway.
It's fun, but you do notice the gender neutral language, which betrays me. Okay, so a question on spirituality. Okay. Can spiritual experiences be explained scientifically?
I don't know. Okay, so there's a couple of layers to this question. I do know, actually. So there's two layers here to the question. The first layer is, are spiritual experiences material in nature? Right. In other words, do they have material effects in the world that you might be able to measure? And the answer to that is probably yes, but I don't really know. The second part of the question is, can you scientifically investigate spiritual experiences? And the answer to that is no. So in order to scientifically investigate a phenomena, that phenomena has to be repeatable and predictable in some way, right? So you can't set up an experiment to measure something that you cannot, a phenomena that you can't predict. We're able to investigate the mechanics of gravity because we can predictably drop something. We're able to mechanically investigate the optical properties of glass because you can shine a light through glass in order to produce the result that you want to investigate. The problem with measuring spiritual experiences scientifically is that the fundamental assumption of a spiritual experience is that you're interacting with an agent, God, who has an independent will and will not respond predictably to stimulus. So it's not like that if you hold a specific church service, God is going to act in this way, because otherwise he wouldn't be an agent, right? He has a will, which is expressed in the way that he responds, and our spiritual experiences are an encounter with that will expressed in his action. So because that action is not predictable, you can't compel God to act. You can't investigate spiritual experiences scientifically. Now, that is not to say that those experiences are necessarily not material. So there's like all kinds of different versions of what you might mean by a spiritual experience. You might mean like an encounter with God speaking to you, like Moses, the burning bush or something. You might mean like an experience of the gifts of the Holy Spirit, something like that. These experiences may or may not be material in nature. It's very difficult to know, but because you can't predictably create them, you can't attempt to measure to determine whether they're material or not.
It's not exactly on the topic of this question, but related to something you were just saying. I've heard studies where they looked at the outcomes of medical procedures for a control group versus a group who are being prayed for.
Yeah.
And they didn't find any statistically significant difference between the outcomes of the two groups.
Yep.
Would you expect there to be a difference? I mean, what you were saying about God being an agent and therefore you can't constrain his will. Sort of the flip side of that would be, well, if God was going to act in a way that was unmeasurable, then by performing the scientific experiment, you are actually constraining God's will in the reverse way. You could actually prevent perfectly genuine Christians from having their prayers answered just because you happened to be performing some kind of experiment. So
only if you assume that the experiment means that God won't act, right? So the fact that no statistical difference was observed is an interesting artifact. I think it actually says much more about God's will with regard to healing than it does about whether or not. So, like, I would say that you could draw the conclusion reasonably that it is at best highly unusual for God to miraculously act with regard to healing in the world. Right?
So how do we reconcile that with James 5?
Well, so we reconcile that with the pattern in Scripture where God's healing power is expressed almost exclusively as part of a particular testimony to reveal his glory in particular circumstances, right? So you see such a huge hyperabundance of healing in the gospel and narrative of Acts because the prophecy for how the Messiah was to be recognized indicates that one of the signs that he is the Messiah is this hyperabundance of healing, right? He comes with healing in his wings. And so we have a specific prophecy from God about Jesus and about the early church that says this is going to be a sign to you, indicating that it's not something that's part of the normal pattern of human life.
To come back closer to the question that our hoplite has asked.
Has asked, yeah.
What do you make of people who talk about having spiritual experiences after taking drugs. They
Yeah. So
eat
this
some
comes back
mushrooms or
to
whatever.
the question of whether spiritual experiences are material, and whether altering your brain chemistry alters your spiritual state. Right.
Hmm.
The current fad is to use like ayahuasca or other hallucinogenic drugs to induce this kind of thing, but it's not really all that different than uh, the historical practices of like self-flagellation or extreme fasting or
Or
extreme
meditation.
isolation. These are all ways to alter your state of conscious in an attempt to make contact with the divine. Um, Interestingly, there's been a lot of attempts to scientifically investigate the material aspects of this kind of phenomena, and there are people who posit that there are changes in the brain chemistry related to prayer and related to practices of meditation and so on. I don't have a strong view as to whether um, as to whether well, okay, so I think that you can probably that by altering your state of conscious, you can open yourself up to contact uh, to spiritual experience, and that sometimes that spiritual experience is an experience with God, and sometimes that spiritual experience is an encounter with demons. I think that that's definitely something that can occur. I think it is taking hallucinogenic drugs to alter your state of consciousness to pursue this experience is something that is explicitly um, forbidden in scripture, right? So when you see the commands in the epistles to be sober and of sound mind, what that's one of the things that's getting at that most people don't appreciate is that altering your state of conscious in order to try to have an encounter with the spiritual realm is something you're actually commanded not to do. And I think that it is correct to interpret that command to include not just the use of alcohol, but the use of other chemical agents to alter your state of conscious, and the use of mechanical methods to hijack your brain's endorphin system to produce an altered state of consciousness. So if you've ever been like really physically sick, you'll understand that, or suffered extreme pain or something. I happen to have a few of these experiences. You can actually alter your state of consciousness by inducing physical pain or by like severely dehydrating yourself or otherwise really damaging your body. I think this is a huge part of the monastic tradition, and I think it's heretical, and I think you should not pursue it. I think it's just outright verboten.
Well, so in a sense, if it's clearly commanded against, the why doesn't matter. But do you have a feeling about the reason that it's forbidden?
Well, I think it's because it's very easy. So there's a command in the New Testament to discern spirits, right? And if you encounter the spiritual realm and you're of sound mind, you're much better placed to make a discerning judgment about what you encounter there, and to not be swept away after things that are not appropriate. Whereas if you encounter the spiritual realm in like an altered state of consciousness as a result of inducing it in one way or another, I think it's much easier to fall into, like, to be drawn away after demons.
It's an interesting idea that. So this just came to mind as a complete speculation. So discard this thought after reading, but perhaps mankind has a more rational, sober mindset than creatures like angels, who are spiritual beings. It's kind of intriguing as there's this strange thing where mankind is created in the image of God in some way. And it's an interesting thought that the fact that we are encouraged to remain embodied and use rational deliberation rather than to just give ourselves full access to the spiritual realm. Perhaps there's something sort of mysterious and significant to that.
Well, I think there is something significant to that, but I don't think we're given full knowledge of exactly why and exactly I don't think we have from scripture a clear, complete answer to why that is. And that's ironically, because of the commands not to explore it, we can't obtain a complete answer, right?
Very interesting. All right. Are you ready to face the hoplite?
Yeah, let's see how I did.
The battle commences. You can feel the tension in the air. There's a lot of money riding on this, the outcome of this. Victory!
There we go.
All right. Would you like to return and bank your 196 gold?
I would like to return and bank my 196 gold.
Wise. Good. Let's move you back and click the bank button. That's not the right place. There you go. Back to the landing.
Back to the landing. Okay.
Good. So, which way would you like to head this time?
Well, I see buried booty over past the dunes of dishonesty.
Yeah,
so that sounds
the
promising
dunes
for the game. So let's try.
Great. So towards the dunes of dishonesty, which is culture. Okay. Whoops. I forgot to change the beast. I guess the hoplite guy's popped up again. He's followed us. And he's still hounding you with questions. This time, is cultural appropriation harmful or is it inevitable?
Yes and yes. So cultures are destroyed by their adoption outside the natural modes of that culture, by contact with others. And not only that, by internal appropriation of the cultural artifact for alternate purposes. So inside a culture, people will appropriate the symbols and practices of that culture in order to try to drive the politics or development of that culture in one direction or another. There's an interesting example in the history of North America where Tecumseh and the Prophet hijacked Native American spirituality to try to create a federation of Native Americans to fight instead of as their individual tribes, as a single unit against American settlement in what's now kind of the eastern part of the Midwest, the Great Lakes region. So I think it's fair to say that Tecumseh and the Prophet appropriated elements of Native American spiritual culture that even though that's their own culture, they had an agenda and they leveraged aspects of their own culture in order to advance that agenda and permanently altered their culture as a consequence. This also happens cross-culturally where the adoption of cultural modes by other parties inevitably alters the culture that's subject to the adoption, right? Indian food has been altered because it's been adopted by Britain in a way that's kind of complicated and unpredictable, but inevitably alters the development and the state of the culture that's encountered. Cultural appropriation is inevitable. It's what people do. historical circumstances and events will always drive both internal and external cultural appropriation at various levels. And it will always, culture is always in a state of creative destruction, where elements of it are being destroyed and elements of it are being being created.
Could you tell me a bit about the story of the indigenous people, if that's the right word, who were living in Canada before it was settled from the West? Because I feel like I hear a lot more about the story of what happened in America, but you're maybe the right person to ask about what went on with the settlers.
Well,
and I also hear that a lot of people, you've got all your public meetings preceded by groveling apologies and that kind of thing. So I've heard the woke story. What's your?
So we're going to tell the story of the eastern 2/3 of Canada, everything east of the Rocky Mountains, because the story of everything west of the Rocky Mountains is completely different and happens at a different time. And one of the things that you have to do in order to tell this story properly is you have to disregard modern borders on the map and think about this story in terms of three river systems that drove both European settlement and the patterns of settlement of Native Americans. The first river system is the Hudson River system, which goes south and exits in New York State. This is the river system that the English settlers were kind of primarily responsible for contact in. The second river system is the St. Lawrence Seaway, which extends to the Great Lake regions and all the way, most things east of the Rockies that don't empty into the Mississippi Basin or don't empty into Hudson's Bay, empty into this river system. So there's a huge east-west corridor there. And then there's the third river system, which is the Churchill River system, everything that empties into Hudson's Bay. And there's three groups of Native Americans here, each of which have a distinct story of their interaction with Canada. The first set of interactions comes in with the first group of settlers in what's now French Canada in the St. Lawrence River system. And that is a very cooperative relationship. So for more than 100 years, Native Americans served as the originators of the fur trade. They trapped and hunted on behalf of French Canadian voyageurs and colonists who bought vast quantities of fur and exchanged iron goods, primarily firearms, pots and pans, those kinds of things. Remember, the Native Americans in North America had no metalworking at all, and had very limited sort of fabric. So goods which were of very little value in Europe were immensely precious to them. Things like tea kettles and so on. They also had no ceramics. So very, very primitive society, suddenly exposed to European industry. And in exchange for trading with French Canada, they had to accept Catholic missionaries. So the Huron and Algonquin people both made alliance with the French settlers in the Quebec colony, and the Micmac as well. But the Huron and the Algonquin are the most significant, and they kind of they have this productive trading relationship. However, the Iroquois, the people immediately to their south, are very upset about this because the Algonquin and the Huron control access to European goods that are then resold through the interior, and control the exit point for fur trade. And they engage in a conflict called the Beaver Wars. which is a conflict over who controls access to the Quebec colony. And the Iroquois come and commit an act of genocide against the Huron, and murder all the Catholic missionaries as well. Famously, Jean de Brebeuf is martyred in this way. This all happens before there's any significant settlement there's like very moderate settlement in the U.S. at this point. So the French Canadian settlers have an almost have a monopoly position on the provision of European goods at this point. And the competition for access sparks the Beaver Wars. Later on, there's English settlement in the Hudson's Bay Valley and in the Hudson River Valley, which creates alternate partners for the remaining Native American tribes. In the Hudson's Bay watershed, this proceeds relatively peacefully basically from the earliest Hudson's Bay colonies all the way up to the sort of 1930s. There's a peaceful trade relationship that follows the pattern I described, where European goods, industrial goods, are exchanged for furs in this area, vast area emptying in Hudson's Bay. And there's essentially no settlement of Europeans, so there's no competition for land particularly. In the Great Lakes region, something quite different happens. Because there's alternate sources for European goods, the Beaver Wars end, and the Native Americans become, there's a tribal division between the Six Nations Iroquois, who become clients of the English settlers, and the Algonquin, who become clients of the French settlers. And there's a number of other tribes that become clients of the French settlers. And in the war between the English and the French, and the 7 Years' War that ends in the conquest of the Quebec colony, Native Americans fight on both sides. And the British Crown, in order to make peace at the end of the 7 Years' War, makes big set-asides for the Native American tribes that fought on both sides in order to try to establish peace. The English settlers, who were shortly to become Americans, were very upset about this because it ends settlement in upstate New York and in Ohio. And it's actually the Quebec Act, which makes peace in this way, is actually named as one of their grievances in the Declaration of Independence. So the Native Americans fight with the British, first in the War of Independence, and then again in the War of 1812, because the British are seen as their protectors against American expansionism. And critically, even after the settlement of Upper Canada, in the aftermath of the American Revolutionary War, after the purchase of large tracts of land for the resettlement of loyalists, Native Americans continue to fight on the side of the British repeatedly. So you have this extremely cooperative relationship in Eastern Canada for the colonial period. Even as the American West is settled, famously Sitting Bull takes refuge after massacring Custard in Canada for a period of 5 years before returning to the US, where he was eventually killed. So Canada has this long history of a very productive, cooperative relationship with Native Americans. That relationship breaks down during the Progressive Era in the early 20th century, where the Canadian government decided that they were going to uplift Native Americans by forcing their children to attend boarding schools called residential schools. And as you might imagine, this is an A1 progressive policy. Take children away from their parents, exterminate their culture, and educate them properly to become, good progressives, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah. It reminds me of I think I heard once that the Aboriginal population of Australia, there were real strong efforts made to dilute their genetic pool to make sure that they all interbred with European.
In this period, the kind of progressives thought that they were going to end they were going to end native cultures in the settler colonies. It's tied up with a lot of progressive ideas from this period. And this is very embarrassing for the modern progressives that run places like Canada. So there's a very aggressive effort at the moment to try to scapegoat the colonial period and the Christian church for this very ugly history. But this history,
it's like a magician distracting you. Look over here, look over here. Don't look at what my left hand is doing.
Yes.
Don't look at the early 20th century.
So if you look at the relationship before the progressives come to prominence in Canada, the relationship is so good that the Native Americans regularly fight on the side of the Canadian government, the British government. And if you look at the relationship after the progressive era, it is entirely hostile.
So it reminds me of a lot of Thomas Sowell talking points about how much better the black population in the US was doing prior to civil, all the
efforts at integration.
Yeah, the integration. I don't know. I'm not sure. Ironically, is the right word, because that might be giving too much credit to the motives of the people implementing the policies, but it has the exact effect of putting fuel on the fire.
It's a very, very ugly history from people who, there are political enemies. We don't have a lot of sympathy for their motives, but you can understand why the current power structure in Canada is so aggressive about trying to distract from this, because they're doing the same thing over again to like the European settler populations. They're trying to use the apparatus of education to separate them from their culture and try to demonize it and try to destroy their traditional religions.
Has Carney talked much about this kind of stuff?
Not really. He's trying to get away from this.
Right.
That
was the impression I got.
You can't avoid talking about it to some extent. But he's trying to end the era where this is like a club that's used to beat the old Canadian identity over the head.
We'll see how long it lasts. This reminds me a little bit of the inauguration of Obama, where his language at that time was all about moving beyond race, and we could stop talking about this. And you wonder if give it a few years and suddenly Carney may have morphed back into Trudeau.
Well, I think one of the issues with Carney is that he's in this profoundly politically weak position. Most people outside of Canada don't appreciate that he can only form a government with the perpetual support of the Quebec Regional Party. So he's very limited in what he can actually do.
Is he giving lots of gimmies to Quebec?
Well, he hasn't yet been able to form a government. He's going to have to bribe Quebec in order to form a government. And my guess is that minority government will not last very long because of this dynamic. And we'll all be back doing the election thing here again in another year or two.
Huh. Good. Well, I've put some extra gold in the pot because you went above and beyond in the answer, but you do have to win the battle. So
let's see how it goes.
Should we have a look? Hoplite guy came back. He dusted
discussion
himself
performance
off.
Is horrible.
Yeah, I'll be honest. Ignore those numbers. They are This is the secret. These numbers are just randomly generated.
Well, victory.
This is look. Let's peel the curtain back a bit here. The whole Gauntlet thing is just a thin veneer around interesting conversations. That's seeing the man behind the curtain.
All right,
but
so I've managed to obtain 80 gold
in your pouch. So once again, you've got the choice of going back and banking it or carrying onwards to.
Well, I came here to access buried beauty or
True
buried booty, so I have.
You've got to go through Benevolence Bay, I think.
Yes, I have to proceed to Benevolence Bay.
The topic of Benevolence Bay is expression.
What does that even mean?
Well, let's see if anyone stumbles across your path. Arachne. The air fills with gossamer threads that seem to move with purpose. At their center waits the Weaver, spinnerets clicking with anticipation.
Well, this is deeply appropriate because I'm in the middle of reading The Hobbit again, and I'm in the part where they're about to get trapped. So,
are you reading it to your children?
No, I've been forbidden from reading this, from reading it to my children. My wife is of the opinion that they must read it themselves. So,
okay. Fair enough. Yes. The Hobbit is a very pleasing little book. This is a complete, let's not go too far down this rabbit hole, but it is a mystery to me how the same creative team that did such a good job on Lord of the Rings seemed to completely miss the point of The Hobbit when they went to make those into films. And it makes me think that they're worth, they deserve less credit for Lord of the Rings because they kind of lucked into.
My unpopular opinion is that the Lord of the Rings movies aren't very good.
Wow.
So
that is a very hipster opinion.
Well,
I guess, are you comparing the Lord of the Rings films to what theoretical Lord of the Rings films you think could be made? Or are you literally saying the Lord of the Rings films are not as good as like a random blockbuster?
I don't like the Lord of the Rings films because I think they detract from the book, right?
Okay. Mm-hmm.
So I think that they artistically damage the book.
I see.
And so I have a hate on for them for that reason.
It's personal.
Yeah, it's not an objective assessment at all of their quality as films. They might be good films as far as films go. I don't care. They thematically damage the books, and they persuade people to certain interpretations about the books, which cause them to miss what I think are really important elements of what Tolkien was trying to communicate.
And how much of that is because they skipped the scouring of the Shire at the end?
Actually, not that much.
Okay.
I think that the great crime occurs in The Two Towers, which is, in my opinion, one of the worst movies ever made in terms of the damage that it does.
Well, let's take the time to undo the damage for our listeners. What I suppose Peter Jackson comes to you with the script just before they start shooting Two Towers and says, "You've got the chance to do a rewrite before we film this thing. What would you change?"
So the thing that I would change is the whole arc of Aragorn as a king coming to his people has to be, he has to not be a reluctant king. He has to be an assertive character, somebody who is near the end of a long journey to reclaim. The issue with it is the book is written about the right assertion of authority as opposed to the wrong assertion of authority, right? Aragorn and Sauron are these alternate king figures, and they both come to their people, or the people they intend to dominate, and they come to their people in alternate ways. And in the book, or in the movie, Aragorn comes as this reluctant figure who accepts the kingship as he kind of falls into it backwards. And we're meant to think that that's actually the virtuous way to come to kingship. You never seek authority, you end up with authority as a consequence.
Right. The only people fit to rule are those who don't want the crown.
Yes, which I think is almost the opposite message that Tolkien's trying to deliver with this character, where he's trying to lay out the righteous assumption of authority in defense of one's people.
I remember seeing somebody, one of our political enemies, tweet, "Gondor has no king, Gondor needs no king."
Yes.
As if that was the message we were meant to take away from Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, but Lord of the Rings is all about what it means to positively take up morally good authority. And by first, I mean, don't get me started on the romantic sub arc, which is just again, there's this wonderful theme for modernity in about Aragorn's desire for children and the reinvigoration of the race of Elendil. That is just like totally inappropriate for a progressive audience. So even in 2002 or whenever that movie was made, it was just like, you couldn't make a story about the reinvigoration of the race of Numenor and about their failing in having too few children and caring too much about their glorious past and not enough about their own progeny. That was just way out of bounds. Even their
takeaway from the love story is that Aragorn is virtuous because he picks the woman from a different species.
Yeah, exactly. So. It's like it's very cringy, but like even just the idea that you wanted to get married, like Aragorn in the book wants to get married in order to have children, right? In order to fill the streets of Minas Tirith with children again. And
that doesn't come in the movies. Through in the movies.
that does not appear at all.
Well, look, let's have a question that's sort of related to what we've just been discussing.
Yeah.
Can art be objectively evaluated? Isn't it all subjective? Like you were just saying,
no.
Your personal rating of The Two Towers as a work relates to your relationship with Two Towers, the book. But surely, if you were to go and see Transformers 3 and then saw The Two Towers, if you had no previous knowledge of either property, you would prefer The Two Towers.
So art can be objectively evaluated. It can be objectively evaluated because the moral and archetypal world in which it inhabits has an objective reality to it. So humans are not blank slates onto which you can write any moral or archetypal universe. They come pre-programmed by God with a whole set of moral ideas and archetypal frames of stories to which art has to be compared in order to assess its quality. So the story of Lord of the Rings as an example of a piece of art is good because it accurately reflects both the moral universe that God created and the archetypal environment of stories that underpin human psychology. Right? And Transformers is actually not that bad as a piece of art because it inhabits the archetypal moral world that really exists out there. That's why little boys love it so much. On the other hand, bad art exists. The Shape of Water is objectively bad art because it doesn't reflect either the objective moral world that God created or the universe of archetypal psychology that is a fundamental element of humanity. It doesn't even reflect the feminine archetypal idea of what good romance is, right? So there is objective assessment of art. It is very difficult to do because we're all imperfect observers of this moral universe. We're all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. We don't have, not only do we have imperfect eyes to look at the art, we also have an imperfect understanding of the moral and archetypal universe that it's supposed to portray. So the fact that we're not very good at objectively analyzing art doesn't mean that it doesn't have objective quality.
Do you think there's space for some art that is reflecting a moral universe where good characters flourish and bad characters are punished, and that trains you towards goodness, but then also there's space for art that depicts the brokenness of reality? I'm thinking a bit like how Proverbs talks about how the good flourish.
Yeah,
and
there's
Ecclesiastes talks. Yeah,
and there's also expressive art, and both are there. There's objectively good expressive art that expresses tragedy, right? It expresses the failure of the broken world in which we inhabit. But again, that art is judged against the standard of its depiction of the objective human experience of suffering in that broken world.
I haven't seen Shape of Water, so I can't comment on it as your example
trying to think
of bad art.
What have you seen that's really horrendous?
Probably loads of things.
Yeah,
I mean, I also have a tendency to. Yes, that's a good question. There's kind of there are movies that I enjoy in a sort of schlocky way.
Well, here's a good example. So you've probably seen the sitcom Friends.
I've seen some episodes of Friends. Yeah.
So there's this. Friends has elements of good art in it, but the story arc elements are bad art because they express romance in a way that doesn't make any sense. Right? It's not a reflection of the underlying psychological realities that actually drive men and women to enjoy each other. Right? So.
Yeah, it was quite a laddish show in a sense, wasn't it? It was kind of encouraging people into these sort of messy relationships where people are sleeping around, and that's meant to be really cool.
Yeah, that's right. But it depicts this kind of laddish world that can't actually exist, right? So if you try to translate the world of Friends into actual reality, you go and investigate SBF's polycule, which is like an idealization of that, an attempt to bring that world that Friends is depicting into the real world, you'll discover that it's disgusting and awful and everybody's miserable.
Yes. So it's like to bring up Proverbs again, it's like the young man who's being lured down the steps of death by the temptress.
Yeah, if you were going to do good art to describe the kind of the laddish cult, you could do good art to describe the suffering of the kind of laddish cultural world that existed in the late 90s. Mm-hmm. You could do that, but Friends doesn't, right? It does something.
Yeah. It's an interesting suggestion. I can't think of any art that does that, but I'd quite like to see it done. Where you could have characters. You could do it almost where I wonder if you could do it just by putting a different soundtrack over Friends.
Yeah.
If you just
take
had
the laugh track away.
Yeah, slow, miserable music.
Yeah.
But kept the characters behaving the same way. So they have these kind of lingering smiles after a joke is told that suddenly becomes an expression of inner pain when juxtaposed against the right.
You could almost
score.
like rewrite it as Brit comedy and it would work perfectly.
Interesting. Yes.
Like a modern version of Only Fools and Horses.
I think a lot of people, I haven't seen enough Friends to really understand the details, but I think the reputation is that Ross as a character, for example, it's after stepping away from watching the show for a few years and then thinking about it, you realize he was actually a really nasty piece of work, and you kind of didn't notice it at the time. But in the cold light of day, the way he behaves is really quite unacceptable. And at least people seem to have kind of digested that as a concept.
Well, I think a lot of it is just we've all lived in the consequences of this idea of consent-based sexual morality for long enough that it's starting to penetrate certain people's minds. This is completely insane and just produces misery. But like in some ways, I think Only Fools and Horses is the better expression of what that's actually like, right? So it tells the story of these guys who are trapped in the. I mean, it's miserable to watch in some ways, but the end of that show where they tell the story of Rodney's marriage collapsing is actually a really good artistic depiction of the reality of life in that world, right? It's profoundly realistic. It maybe enhances the suffering a little bit because it's Brit comedy, and that's part of what it does. But it might be as close as something that exists to kind of an artistic depiction of the misery that comes out of that world.
It sounds like you maybe would have more affinity in general for British comedy than American comedies. Where British comedy,
I'm a dour, downcast person, so. You know.
There's that line in the song "Time" from Dark Side of the Moon that says, "Hanging on in quiet desperation is the English way." I've always thought that's one of the most beautiful reflections on modernity ever captured.
Well, I mean, I'm a Canadian. Being Canadian, gallows humor is like an essential part of the Canadian character.
There's a lot of similarity between Canadian and British.
I wonder why that would be.
Stereotypes, at least. We're both the kind of quietly embarrassed brothers of the States.
All right. Great. How did I do versus the arachnid here?
Let's find out, shall we? Go. And I think this will be your last action in the gauntlet. So I'll let you. Yes, victory. Well done. So I'll let you return to the landing and bank your gold.
All right.
And then you shall retire. Hang up your gauntlet, as it were.
Well, I must have done pretty well because
I think you are currently top of the leaderboard.
Well, because I lost right away the first time, so that's always a good way to stack
strategically. Yes, you sort of had a lucky defeat, as it were.
There you go.
Okay, I'll click bank so I don't forget. Yes, you are current leader, and by a margin, I would say. So who knows? You may win the. I've got a few more guests to go, but you may hang on to that position.
We'll see. I was bottom board on the last gauntlet because I went too early in it. So
you've learned your lesson. I think Pharaoh might end up being the last person to run this gauntlet.
But this system doesn't have grade inflation because it's a random number generator. So,
so you think going first or going later doesn't make any difference because it's all RNG.
Yeah. Well, last time I was the devious victim of just totally unfair grade inflation. So
it's just like the parable of the is it the vineyard where people are hired throughout the day? I am the mercurial owner of this island, and everybody who gets points at all should just be grateful.
Grateful for them.
Well, thank you so much for playing, and spectacular performance, sir.
Thank you so much. It's good to you were the first person to ever invite me onto a show, and I'm always glad to come back.
Oh, well, my pleasure.